So we're looking at going through the book of Philippians, and if you have a Bible, you can go to chapter 2 with me, and I'm gonna read us from there, just from verse 1. So, if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. So we're sort of looking at humility today and counting others more significant than we count ourselves. And my first thought when I was thinking about this was immediately being in Sainsbury's and sort of near sort of the beginning of when the panic started to set in, and just all the loo rolls just going like that, and just people filling their trolleys with stuff, and it just kind of made me a bit angry and a bit annoyed on the inside. I just thought there was no sort of sense of care for others, or for what if other people might need this, but it seems to be just a bunkered down sort of focused mindset of we're just going to panic buy, we're going to get everything, it doesn't matter about anybody else, doesn't matter if they need stuff, I need to put myself first because there's a crisis, so I need to put myself and my tribe and my family first, and everyone else, well, they'll just have to figure their own way out. It's a dog eat dog world, and there's something within us, I think, when we were hearing that, and for a lot of people, that just felt wrong, and something felt quite wrong about that. And even as a culture, we seem to sort of really jar against that, which is interesting. And I sort of think, why is that? And I think partly I think we understand the need of the common good above the individual or the self, but I think also we are, as a culture, over the years we have been, over the generations, the centuries, we're a culture that's been shaped by the life of Jesus in ways that often our culture doesn't quite accept or seem to recognize, but that we seem to have this value of caring for one another, this value that we can appeal to in times of crisis. And it seems to go against what sort of it can be called a scarcity mindset, and this mindset that there isn't enough, and therefore I need to gather what I can, and it's not always done from a place of anger, but or a place, or a negative place, but it can just come from a place of I'm fearful, and I just need to gather what I can, and I'm because I'm need to protect myself, because there's limited resources out there. And in many ways, what our passage is looking at is we're talking about this idea of humility, and Paul's writing into the context of the Philippian church, and in sort of Greco-Roman culture at this time. Well, some of the context of that is it was a honor-shame culture. Now, some of you might sort of have heard that expression before, but what it means is that it was a culture where, in the same way that loo roll has become sort of like something which people want to grab for themselves, it's a scarcity mindset. Something similar like that is applied to the idea of honor. That to be honored is something that is a zero-sum game. If I'm honored, that means you are not, like someone else somewhere is not honored. So there's a certain amount of honor in the world, and I need to get as much as I can for myself. I need to work my way up to the top, because in this culture there was a very defined pecking order. So right at the bottom you had slaves, and unfortunately you would have female slaves at the bottom, probably. In a patriarchal culture, it was not good, and there would be different pecking orders of where people could sort of work themselves up, and a lot of that would have been done through trying to get people around you who would be valuable, who are a little bit above you, so that they could sort of draw you up, and they would sort of bring you up to where they are. So it's very much about who you know. Another part of this culture was, it was a patronage culture. And I don't know if some of you have heard that word of what that means, but basically a patron was someone who would sponsor you. So if you wanted to move up in the world, if you wanted, then you would get what you needed was a patron. You needed somebody to back you. And so and that was how social mobility worked in the ancient Greco-Roman world. If you wanted to have anything for yourself, you needed to work your way up and find that honor. And in many ways we can think, oh, what a terrible culture that was. But there are a lot of similarities with today. We live in a culture where our reputation is important to us. We live in as Al was talking about a couple of weeks ago, we live in an individualistic culture. Not a couple of weeks ago, I think it was yesterday. The days are all blurring into one. We live in an individualistic culture where it's about self first. It's about I think it was a couple of years ago that the word selfie went into the dictionary. And with the advent of the iPhone in 2007 and social media, Instagram, it feeds the beast of projecting my reputation out there, trying to work my way up. It's how a lot of business still works today. We're not too far from things as sometimes we like to think we are. Things aren't always an equal playing field where you're just judged on your merit often. And so there's some similarities there with the culture. And within this, Paul is saying to his Philippian church, you're not to be like that. The way I want you to relate to one another is, I want you to count one another as if they're higher than you, as if their status is higher than yours, so that your role to them is to serve them and to love them. He's almost saying, I want you to adopt the posture of a servant in all of your relationships, whether you're sitting with somebody who is 20 rungs down the ladder from you, or whether you're with someone who is way up there, which in the church they had this amazing mixture of people from all different walks of life, which was an amazing thing that the gospel did. It broke down some of these barriers. And Paul says, I want you to look at this when you're with this person who is is a slave in their master's house, and they've managed to sneak out for 15 minutes to get to be at a church meeting. He said, I want you to treat them as if they are your superior. I count them more significant than you count your own needs and your own reputation. This would have been radical. This would have been totally against the grain of what the culture, how the culture operated. But Paul is subverting that, and he instead calls for this idea of humility. And some of us, when we talk about humility, we kind of know what it means, but we're not really sure how to become humble. And is it just this sort of like modesty thing? Do I just continually put myself down and just sort of think, well, I'm just me, and I'm not that great, and that's humility, and that's not really what Paul's talking about here. In many ways, he's talking about humility not as a feeling that you feel, but as an action. So if you notice, he says, in humility, count others more significant than you count yourself. Look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Humility is worked out. It's something that you you actively count others more significant than you count yourself. It's about serving others and serving God rather than seeking your own glory and seeking your own reputation. And it's predominantly sort of how do we use the power and the influence that God has given us? Do we use the resources, the power that we have? Because all of us have a degree of power and a degree of resources. What do we use those for? Do we use those primarily to serve ourselves and to serve our own tribe and the people that we want to care about? Or do we primarily use it to serve God and to serve others? And this is sort of the history of, humanity. If you wanted to look at I remember someone said recently, if you wanted to look at the history of humanity and the choice before humanity, the question is, how will you use the power that God has given you? So right from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, instead of receiving all that God had given them, because he'd given them power, he'd given them influence, he'd made them in his image. He said, I've put you over all, I've given you dominion over all the works of my hands. He'd given them everything, but there was one thing he hadn't given them. And instead of settling to serve God and serve others, they wanted to reach out and take the very thing that God said, that is not for you, that will bring you death. And that use of power to take for yourself, we then just see sort of repeated and repeated and repeated. And the Cain and Abel story, in the story of, you look through Genesis and you just see this pattern of self-seeking, people using power to oppress the weak, the strong oppressing the weak, for their own benefit and to amass their own wealth. And unfortunately, we still see that today. But in the middle of this, we see Jesus. And Jesus does something very different. He doesn't use his power to oppress the weak or to seek his own reputation or to gather things for himself or to look after himself. But when we look at the life of Jesus, we see a life that is lived almost every action, and even every action you read through the Gospels, everything is always about God and others with Jesus. If we see that in the way that he uses his power to welcome the sinners and the tax collectors, and even though that is actually dragging his social reputation through the mud with those who were deemed important and significant leaders in his culture, that dragged his reputation right down. But for Jesus, that didn't matter to him in any regard, because his life was orientated towards what truly mattered, and that was who God had called him to be and the people that he was serving. And it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing that can sometimes we can get used to. But we see that we see this in Jesus' teaching when he says, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. We see this when Jesus goes to the cross, and he becomes, in terms of the pecking order, I was talking about, there was a very defined pecking order. Probably right at the bottom was a crucified criminal. Why? Because the crucifixion was not just meant to be a painful death, it was meant to be a shameful death. It was meant to be a public mockery where you could see, this is the scum of the earth. This person is so debased, so worthless, that he is the lowest of the low, the absolute lowest of the low, hanging there naked, bleeding. Jesus uses his power to give it up for our sake, to love us, to bless us, that we can know forgiveness, that we can know a relationship with God, that we can have our hearts changed so that we can follow him in this action of love. Recently, I hate to say I have got the Disney Plus app on my TV, because we need something to do in the evenings, and it's awesome. I love it. And one of the shows on there is the show is the Disney movie Aladdin. And I don't know if you've seen that or you know the story, but basically Aladdin is this poor, humble street rat, as they call him, and he comes across a magic lamp which he finds in a cave, which I won't go into how he gets there. But in this magic lamp is this genie, and you probably know the story. The genie gives him 3 wishes, and he uses his first 2 wishes. Basically, his first wish is he wants to become rich and powerful and be a prince, so he can impress this princess that he's in love with, because he thinks, that's what I need. I need this reputation. I need this honor. I need to be seen in this way, because that's the only way that I will ever have anything in this life. And he starts off, and he says to the genie, I'll use my 3rd wish to set you free, because the genie is a prisoner. And as the time goes on, he realizes that he becomes insecure about this fact, and he realizes that his status is wrapped up with what this genie has made him, and he thinks, I can't use my last wish to set him free. I need to keep him around. I need to keep this reputation, keep everything that I've got. I can't let it go. And eventually he has everything taken away from him through the evil bad guy Jafar. And there's a huge sort of battle, and everything sort of goes on. And eventually, after he comes back, he finds himself back in possession of the lamp, and he still has his 1 wish. But this time he says, I'm going to set you free. And he uses his wish to set free this genie, and you see that kind of the shackles kind of come off. And it's just this moment, and it still kind of makes me sort of quite emotional when I watch it, which I'm happy to admit that, because what I see there is, I just think there's something very Jesus-like about that image, that he had, with his power that he uses it to set us free, not to make himself great and in the eyes of others. He didn't, Satan took him when he was tempting him, he took him and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and says, you can have all of this if you just avoid the cross, basically. Avoid going through suffering. Just bow down, worship me, take this different path of life. You can have all of this. And Jesus says, no, I'm going to use the power that I have to serve others. And so I just wanted to those are my kind of thoughts on humility this morning. And I want to sort of ask us, where can we use our power and the influence that God has given us to serve others, to love others, not to seek our own reputation or to gather things for ourselves. It's not wrong to when we need those, sometimes we need to have an element of self-care in order that we've got something to give. I understand that. But primarily, I think Paul is saying that our orientation is not around ourselves. Our orientation is around who Jesus is and looking at his life. And that's sort of our true north, if you like. That's when we look at the life of Jesus, that should be like a true north of, how am I to use the power that God's given me to set others free, to love others, to even if it costs to myself. In fact, it almost nearly always is a cost to ourselves, isn't it? When we love others, when we serve others, it always takes something. And so we know, though, that actually Paul says that there's a joy that comes from that we can know the love of God and his presence, then that he is more than enough. That even if it costs something in the short term, that actually we know that his love, his joy that he gives us as we're serving others is better than what we could have ever tried to grab for ourselves.